D-Day. On the easternmost stretch of bloody Omaha, the men of the legendary US 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, stormed ashore in an attempt to gain a foothold in Fortress Europe. Under withering machine gun and mortar fire, they paid a heavy price. But amidst the carnage, ordinary soldiers rose to achieve the extraordinary. Join us as we follow those men and the story of what happened on Omaha Beach. By the summer of 1944, the planning for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Europe, was in its final stages. 5 stretches of beach in occupied Normandy had been selected as the landing points for Allied troops, with the British assigned to Golden Sword beaches, the Canadians at Juneau, and the Americans at Utah and right here, the infamous Omaha. Omaha stood out from the rest of the D-Day beaches for one main reason: these bluffs, which ran all along the beach and offered an imposing defensive position for Germans guarding the Atlantic Wall. The defenders had set up a series of strongpoints known as Widerstand or resistance nests, dotted along the coast, each possessing its own set of anti-tank defenses, mortars, machine guns, and each guarded by up to 50 men. These nests were designed to provide interlocking fields of fire to give any attacking force as little chance as possible of securing a foothold. There was a solution, however. At certain points in the bluffs were natural gaps, known as draws, that provided valuable exits for men and vehicles to get off the beach. If these draws could be taken, the beach could be won. So who would do the attacking? Well, Omaha itself had been divided into sectors across its 5-mile stretch. The western sectors of the beach would be assaulted by the newly formed 29th Infantry Division, supported by 2 Ranger battalions, while the eastern sectors would be taken by the battle-tested 1st Infantry Division. For this video, we'll be focusing on the battle that took place here at the easternmost portion, designated Fox Green. The main objective at Fox Green was this draw identified as F1, or the Cabourg draw, due to its proximity to the village of the same name. 2 WNs guarded Fox Green and were positioned on either side of the draw, WN 60 and 61. Let's take a look. WN 60, covering this area right here, possessed 2 75mm guns, a French tank turret mounted in a concrete bunker, 4 mortars, numerous machine guns, and at least 40 German defenders. WN 61 in this location contained at least 2 mortars and machine guns, its own tank turret, a 5cm anti-tank gun, and even a formidable 88mm PaK 43, one of only 2 present on Omaha. In order to secure the draw, these positions would need to be silenced, and the unit tasked with doing so, and our focus, was 3rd Battalion of the 16th Infantry Regiment under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles T. Horner. Having gained battle experience in Operation Torch in North Africa and Operation Husky in Sicily, the regiment, and indeed the rest of the 1st Division, were a strong choice for the assault on Omaha. The 3rd Battalion was divided into 4 companies of between 150 and 180 men each. Companies I and L would be in the first wave, landing at H-hour, scheduled for 6:30 a.m. Company K would follow in the second wave, landing half an hour behind the first. In the third, Company M would arrive with heavy weapons, by which point the beach was to have been mostly secured. But as the old saying goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So, as the men boarded their transports and set sail for Normandy, they watched on early on the 6th of June as an immense naval bombardment accompanied by aerial bombing roared overhead to soften up the German defences. This would prove futile though, as much of the naval fire failed to hit their targets, and a dense cloud cover, coupled with the fear of friendly fire, meant that many B-24 Liberator bomb aimers held their payloads for longer than required. When those bombs were dropped, the majority fell well behind their intended targets. A short time later, as the seasick, cold and wet men started in, rough seas and strong currents took effect, forcing many craft to either capsize or drift to the east. To make matters worse, as we see in this famous footage, smoke caused by the bombardment obscured the landing zones. As a result, a large number of troops found themselves well off their mark. Around 7 a.m., 30 minutes later than intended, Company L, under Captain John Armelino, drifted just left of Fox Green, and most of his craft became beached on submerged obstacles roughly 200 yards offshore. With machine gun and mortar fire churning up the sea around them, the men had no choice but to wade through the open water towards the beach. One landing craft took a direct hit by artillery, with 19 men becoming casualties. The rest of the company continued to make their way ashore, eventually taking shelter here at the base of the tall cliffs. But in that advance, Company L had been hit hard, losing 64 men in the initial landing, roughly a quarter of their total strength. Now, section leaders began organising their men, while the medics tended to the wounded as best they could, often while exposed to heavy enemy fire. Accompanying Company L in the first wave was Sergeant Richard Taylor of the 165th Signal Photographic Company, who captured this incredible scene of the men on the beach that morning, one of the few pieces of footage we have of D-Day on Omaha. Despite being wounded in the arm, Taylor continued to film as the men sheltered below the cliffs and prepared to continue the assault. At the same time, Company I, under Captain Kimball Richmond, had drifted so far east they'd missed Omaha entirely. Now Richmond found his men heading to the small village of Port-en-Bessin and away from the fight. Richmond ordered his coxswain to take them back to the beach, but when the coxswain refused, the company commander drew his pistol, stating, "If you don't take us where we need to go, I'll take us where we need to go." There was no further argument. While en route back to Omaha, Richmond radioed Colonel Horner, informing him that Company I would not be able to take WN-60 as instructed. Horner in turn contacted Captain Anthony Prucknell of Company K, saying the task now fell to them. K arrived at 7:05, with all craft landing safely just here. As with Company L, the men had to make their way up the shore under a hail of fire and sustained many casualties in the process. Finally, after a hellish landing, riflemen took up firing positions along the rocky shingle and began shooting back at the defenders. In the chaos, Lieutenant Brandt, the company's executive officer, was wounded out in the open, and Prucknell himself ran out to retrieve his wounded friend. But upon reaching him, a mortar shell landed, killing them both. Command now transferred to Lieutenant James Robinson, but only minutes later he too was killed by sniper fire while attempting to organise his men. Now, Second Lieutenant Leo Stumbaugh had the burden placed on him. Being a fresh West Point graduate in action for the very first time, he faced a literal trial by fire. Around 7:25 a.m, an LCM, or landing craft mechanised, carrying around 100 personnel of the regimental headquarters landed on Fox Green. They were led by the regiment's XO, Lieutenant Colonel John H. Matthews, whose task it was to set up a command post to coordinate the push inland. Matthews, a respected leader, had already shown distinction in previous campaigns, earning the Silver Star in North Africa and the Distinguished Service Cross in Sicily. Sadly, he would get no opportunity for heroics here, for as he stepped off his craft into the surf, he was shot through the head by machine gun fire, becoming the highest ranking officer of the 1st Division killed on D-Day. The rest of the headquarters company surged towards the beach, with another 35 being lost by the time they joined the remnants of the first wave here at the shingle. With much of their radio equipment waterlogged, there was no way to establish communication with offshore command. Then one man, Technician 5th grade John Pinder, began moving up and down the beach to scavenge radio parts. Though twice wounded, he refused medical attention, eventually finding enough parts to get a radio in working order. He then set out to find one more set, but in the process sustained a third and fatal wound. It was of all days his 32nd birthday. By 7:50 a.m, Company M, carrying the heavy weapons, landed with relatively few casualties and immediately went to work. A machine gun section opened fire on a pillbox, neutralising it, finally allowing Companies K and L to move up. A section of mortars now took up a firing position, ready to support the next assault. By 8 a.m, Company I, having found their way back to the beach, joined the fray. But en route to shore, their boats also came under fire, with Captain Richmond forced to abandon his craft and swim ashore. Once on the sand, Richmond began trying to reorganise the battalion's forces, which by now had been joined by elements of F Company from 2nd Battalion, as well as engineers, artillery, and even a few tanks. Those tanks, 75mm armed Shermans, managed to knock out the powerful 88mm in WN-61 rather quickly, but the 5cm gun located just here was still causing havoc. It was later knocked out by a bazooka-wielding sergeant from F Company, allowing more room for tanks to manoeuvre. Spotting an opportunity, Captain Armelino of L Company ran to a couple of Shermans to better direct their fire, but was severely wounded on his return, so Lieutenant Robert Cutler took charge, splitting the company into 3 sections. The first, led by 26-year-old Virginian Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith, was to go along the left, while the second, under Lieutenant Williams, would go along the right side of the draw. Lieutenant Kenneth Klenk would take his section up this gully to the west of Williams. All were to make their way to this coastal road behind the draw, taking out any opposition they encountered along the way. Before assaulting, Monteith made his way to the nearby Sherman tanks, just as Armelino had done, to get them to concentrate their fire on the remaining defences at WN60. With support established, the men pushed through barbed wire and across minefields, all the while being subjected to sniper and machine gun fire. Yard by yard they moved, eliminating pockets of enemy resistance but taking heavy casualties in the process. Monteith and his men soon made contact with the defenders of WN60, while Williams encountered a small fortified position of Germans just to the south. Monteith was able to break free from WN60 and continued south to set up a defensive position. Klenk, once he made his way up the bluffs, was to turn to the left and meet with the other 2 sections. However, he turned too early, missing Monteith and Williams, and soon found himself at the wire surrounding WN60. Using grenades and satchel charges, Klenk and his men eliminated the German machine gun positions one by one. By this point, tank and mortar fire had managed to clear the WN's heavy guns. With their main defences neutralised and their position outflanked, the remaining defenders had no choice but to surrender. By 9 AM, WN60 had been secured, the first of all the WNs to fall on Omaha. The F1 draw was now, at least from one side, free from the enemy, but it would be some time before it was put to proper use. Soon after WN60's capture, the remaining forces on the beach made the final assault on WN61. Company F of 2nd Battalion led the charge as the German defenders rolled grenades down and poured machine gun fire into the advancing troops. Lieutenant Stumbaugh of K Company grabbed what men he could and dashed through the enemy fire straight at a defensive position, forcing the Germans in it to withdraw. With supporting fire from destroyers that had made their way closer to shore now taking effect, the men overran the nest and in doing so opened the F1 draw. But the fight was far from over. Beyond the beach, Company L began digging in at this road junction to await reinforcements. Lieutenant Cutler decided to send out 2 patrols to reconnoitre the surrounding area. One, led by PFC Lawrence Mylander, headed towards the village of Cabot. But as they approached, his patrol was surrounded and ultimately captured. He, incredibly, would return the following morning with 52 German prisoners who he had convinced in turn to surrender to him. Meanwhile, the 2nd Patrol, under Staff Sergeant Burton Davis, headed east towards Le Grand Amour. But near the village, under a hail of gunfire and reportedly English-language insults about the men's mothers, was forced to withdraw. Around noon, Captain Richmond arrived in the L Company perimeter with the remnants of K Company and others, taking command as the ranking officer. Richmond's forces arrived in the nick of time, but within 2 hours the perimeter came under a German counterattack from both east and west. The Americans were well positioned, however, and were able to hold back the onslaught. During the fight, the Germans began to set up machine guns all around the American defences. Seeing this, Lieutenant Monteith, with rifle in hand, crawled his way along this hedgerow until he was within range of the enemy. Monteith fired a rifle grenade, silencing a machine gun. He continued along the hedgerow, neutralising another gun team, and yet another shortly after that. Monteith was determined to take out a 4th machine gun to the east, but tragically, his luck didn't hold. As he closed in, the Germans spotted him and opened fire. Monteith fell dead just here, but his actions had bought his unit valuable breathing room. By 5 PM that day, the German attack had faltered, and they withdrew. The Americans had held the line. After recovering from the attack, Richmond sent another patrol into Le Grand Amour, and when no German defenders could be found, he ordered the rest of 3rd Battalion into the village to hold for the night. By about 8:30 PM, the exhausted attackers of the Big Red One, joined by 17 tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion, had dug in. They had won their foothold on Omaha Beach. The toll, though, had been a heavy one. The 16th Infantry Regiment suffered nearly 1,000 casualties on D-Day alone, making up almost half of the roughly 2,400 total casualties across all of Omaha. Although exact figures are uncertain, it's believed around 770 Americans lost their lives that day, many of whom still lie in this cemetery just a stone's throw from the beach. In the coming days, the remnants of the German resistance around the beachhead were eradicated, and the liberation of Normandy and much of Europe could finally begin. While the battle for Fox Green is not as recognisable as other parts of Omaha Beach, it still played a vital role in the operation as a whole. The heroism demonstrated by the men who took part would stand above it all. As officers fell one by one, others shouldered the responsibility, and it was their ability to adapt, their displays of bravery, and their courageous actions that inspired their men to victory. Many who fought that day received recognition for their accomplishments. Lieutenant Stumbaugh, untested until that morning, remained unfazed as he charged German lines, earning a Silver Star in the process. Lieutenant Cutler's bold charge, which resulted in the fall of the 1st WN, and Captain Richmond's organisation in the face of an enemy counterattack, earned both men the Distinguished Service Cross. This part of Omaha also saw courage recognised at the highest level. Technician John Pinder, who had risked everything to re-establish contact with Offshore Command, and Lieutenant Monteith, who braved enemy fire on the beach, in the bluffs and beyond, both paid the ultimate price that day. Neither man living to learn that they'd been awarded the Medal of Honor. Today, the actions of the officers and men of the Big Red One are remembered right here at the 1st Infantry Division Memorial, overlooking the very ground where so many of their comrades fell in the liberation of Europe. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our other Omaha Beach content right here on YouTube. And if, like us, you find the Second World War endlessly interesting, be sure to tune into World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, our dedicated podcast where each week historians Professor Matthias Strone and Jesse Alexander explore World War II from both the Allied and Axis perspectives. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.